that, over to you, Arman.
Thank you, Attila. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Arman Harutyunyan. I work at the Change team. I've been working on the revision of the resource allocation framework, and I think this is really the first detailed presentation of it. So it's a bit of a testing ground also for me. I tried to keep it short, but still ended up with more than 10 slides. And it's a very dense content to be presented after lunch, so this is a double challenge, but nevertheless, I'll try. So, what we're going to discuss today, the rationale for the new resource allocation framework. I'll just give a quick overview why we're doing this. And then we'll dive into the actual content, which is authorities delegated to heads of sub-offices, representatives, regional bureaus, and so on and so forth. What are the provisions for emergency response, and some of the conditions, restrictions governing delegation of authority. So, rationale for the revision. I think the main driver is really to align the resource allocation framework with the whole philosophy of the decentralization and regionalization, which is shifting power of balance away from HQ, enabling decision-making at local regional level. This is really the main thrust of it. There has been a significant delegation of authority and introduction of new ones, as well as there are other elements which are more subtle. The 2007 RAF, which still governs what we do day to day when it comes to budget and position management, is significantly outdated. And particularly when we move to CNA, comprehensive needs assessment based planning, we have adopted pillar-based budget structure in 2010, and unfortunately, we've issued very fragmented guidance on how to deal with the pillar-based budget structure when it comes to resource management. And this all drove also to some practices, both good and bad, to emerge, which are mostly not documented or partly documented. It really depends whom you talk to, so there is an urgent need for clarity. So with this in mind and many other elements with which I won't spend the time, let's get into the delegation of authority. Everything you see marked with this little green sign on the screen is actually new authority. And for the first time, UNHCR is actually delegating or formally delegating authority to heads of sub-offices. This is a major step. Until now, it has been at the discretion of country representatives, and approach has been very different, has been implemented, basically custom implementation in every country wherever it happened. What is really being delegated is ability for heads of sub-offices to revise the ops budget of their cost center within the pillar, so they cannot move money between pillars, but they can really revise, which means revision of what happened, what we implement directly, and what we implement through partners. They're allowed to make revisions within their ABOT and staff budget. Staff budget are driven by the position changes. They can move money between ABOT and staff, and they can move OL from staff ABOT to ops. This is existing set of delegation that was kept at country level, so the organization decided to really shift it to the sub-office level. Next part is the position changes. The heads of sub-offices are formally delegated the authority to manage positions from G1 to G5 level, and also national affiliate workforce. One more major change in the RAF is the acceptance of goods and services in kind. This is being delinked from operating level as of 2020, and heads of sub-offices are allowed within the existing guidance concerning in-kind contributions to accept goods and services for the sub-office. Moving to the next level are the delegation of authorities for the representatives. I will just focus only on the new elements because it's a combination of old and new. So one change that happened when it comes to budget management is to allow OP, operations plan changes, which is basically the revision of AOL within the same pillar but across different categories. What happened, we've noticed that the number of operations, we significantly put a lot of resources into Ops AOL, but Abbott and stuff are not budgeted, or there is very little budget. And with other authorities that we'll see later on, that creates a problem with this authority is not delegated, meaning you cannot create Abbott AOL without a delegation. So it allows to move Ops AOL to Abbott AOL. And I'll get to the details of the other delegations. Another important, really big step forward is delegation of OL increases to the country representatives with certain conditions attached when the revenue backing the OL increase is coming from sources administered by UN. And this is really pooled funds, the trust funds, the SURF allocations, and so on and so forth. Essentially, from next year, local fundraising from these sources of funding will basically enable the field operations to increase their operating level. Same goes for the local fundraising from private sector partners, again, global or local. As you see, there are no financial ceilings, which means if you fundraise locally and within the parameters of PSP parameters, 10 million, 15 million, the decision to increase the OL by that amount is delegated to the country operations. This is a significant departure from the current across-the-board centralization of OL increases, which is with the budget committee. A bit more on delegation to representatives. Structural changes which have been formally centralized across the board are being decentralized, so representatives can actually open, close, or modify field offices and field units. There are some position changes that have been delegated to representatives, which is the creation or replacement of JPO positions, plus all the other authorities they have had are being retained. And as I mentioned, the acceptance of in-kind goods and services. Now, I think this is the biggest chunk of changes in the RAF Part 1, which is authorities delegated to the regional bureau directors. Again, I'll focus only on the areas that are new. So one is like at the country level, delegation of AUL revision. SAM is basically delegated to bureau directors across the country operations and regional activities, which is moving OP across different country programs, but also between pillars. Until now, any movement between pillars has been fully centralized with the budget committee. The movement between pillars is now also delegated to the regional bureau directors. Same applies to the OL reallocations. This whole second block of authorities, movement of OL between pillars is again delegated to the regional bureau directors. So if a country wants to make a change, they need to request such a change from a regional bureau. And another important element of delegation, as you can see at the very last bullet point, which is a delegation of transfers from OPS to ABOT. The High Commissioner decided that there will be annual ceilings set for regional bureau directors, depending on the size of the region, within which the bureau directors would have the authority to move OL from OPS to ABOT. There are a number of conditions that govern all these delegations that I have spoken to this far, but one important I would like to mention right now, which is the earmarking. All these changes are subject to respecting earmarking, both of the recorded contributions as well as existing projections. Moving on with the regional level, like the country level, if there is fundraising from intergovernmental organizations, regional fundraising or local fundraising, as well as from the PSP partners, whether it's a global or local, the OL increases for this regional fundraising is delegated to the bureau directors. So it no longer needs to be referred to headquarters. The whole delegation from the public sources and private sources fundraising can be found in the Annex A and Annex B of the resource allocation framework that was issued end of August. I mean, the details are outlined there, so I'm just highlighting what is being delegated. Another area that has been frustrating field operations is the OL increase to absorb situational earmarking. This is being delegated now to regional bureau directors. This is particularly important for large SV operations or ongoing emergency operations, which attract earmarked funding at a very fast pace and which necessitates increases of oil on the go. All these authorities that are here can be also exercised across regions when there is a joint agreement between regional bureau directors. Basically, between 2, 3, all the 7 bureau directors can agree on movement if there is such a case. I believe this is the last slide on the regional bureaus, which is, again, the new elements are the structural changes. Opening or closing of sub-offices and changing the status of sub-office is delegated to the regional bureau directors. You must ask why. Probably this is with the regional directors, but not the country representatives. The reason being that sub-offices often play a significant role in cross-border operations. So decision in one country may affect an operations in the neighboring country. So that's why the sub-office level decision-making has been retained at the regional level. The next element is really the creation and upgrades of P1 up to P4 level positions. This has been centralized, you would recall, a couple of years ago when we moved into ranking post system, when basically whoever is appointed to a grade higher immediately acquires the promotion to that level. When we moved that change in HR, the HQ has frozen the upgrades and creation delegation. It was all centralized. So now this is all being decentralized, subject to an offset condition, which has been there already from 2007. And last but not least, the acceptance of in-kind contributions also for, if there are regional contributions coming in, the bureau directors can approve the acceptance for the countries and regional activities. Now, everything I've presented so far about regional directors was about the country operations and regional activities. There is a specific delegation for the resources of the regional bureaus of their own regional resources, which is basically their staffing table and ABOD. And here, there are very similar delegations like in country, at the country level. However, structural changes of the regional bureaus have to be referred to the senior executive team. So while the bureau directors can do some adjustments in the bureaus structures themselves, and they can also move resources out of regional bureaus to field operations, they cannot significantly alter the architecture of the regional bureaus. This is particularly important to functions that are now included in the regional bureaus that actually support the resource allocation framework, the execution of the RAF, plus the delegation in the area of supply and human resources. So this far has been about the field operations and the regional bureaus. I thought just to give a full picture, which to also include the delegation of authority for HQ managers. And when I mention HQ managers, these are the directors of divisions at headquarters, as well as the heads of services and some units that report directly to individual members of senior executive team. Again, what are the new elements? The OP changes that are being delegated, the movement across divisions and entities with the joint agreement, structural changes that are being delegated up to the section for sections and units, which is changing, creating, phasing out sections and units within those divisions. There is a long list of adjustment of authorities to the Deputy High Commissioner, AHC Operation, AHC Protection, on all areas. I haven't listed them in the PowerPoint because that would have made it probably more than 20 slides. So since we have only 1 hour, I just thought I'll limit the presentation only to the key areas that require specific attention. Now I'd like to turn to the budget committee. So I've mentioned a lot of things have been delegated, but a number of things are still retained under the authority of the budget committee. Number one, OP net reductions. in last few years, we've started practicing adjustments to our comprehensive budget that is approved by the ExCom. We've had budgets reduced in different parts in Syria operation, recently in Cameroon and other places, which is basically in response to changing in the overall needs. This reduction stays with the budget committee. Reallocations that are not delegated, such as reallocation from ops to staff and ABOT, and when it comes to ABOT, it's in excess of the ceiling that I've mentioned earlier for bureau directors. Reallocations from country operations, regional activities to regional bureaus and headquarters entities, and reallocations from global programs to headquarters across the board. So this is all centralized with the budget committee. When it comes to the earmarked revenue surpluses, we have a sort of a safe fail provision in the resource allocation framework, which is if there is no decision at the regional level or by the HCO within 10 days of the surplus being recorded, the decision will be taken by the budget committee. So this is going to put a bit of pressure on bureau directors to quickly decide what to do with the revenue surplus. And any surplus that comes for regional bureaus themselves or HQ divisions entities will have to be referred to the budget committee. Increases, this is not a change, I'm just listing, but it's important to understand all budget committee authorities. Oil increases that are not linked to any earmarked surpluses or local fundraising. So any regular increase of oil that requires additional investment when there is no additional funding will be referred back to the budget committee. Position changes will again be referred to the budget committee in situations when there is no offset identified. So in other words, if the net count of positions in PD category remains the same, decisions within that are decentralized. Whatever creates additional PD or FS positions, which are all international positions which create significant liabilities in the organization in financial terms, would remain centralized. Last couple of elements, transfers from NAM and operational reserve will continue to be exercised by the budget committee with exception of emergency reserve, about which I'll speak in a minute. The creation of supplementary budgets would remain centralized with the budget committee. And since I've mentioned a number of conditions, restrictions that govern the delegation, if there are certain decisions that cannot be taken by an individual manager due to some restriction, will be referred to the budget committee. We will get to the restriction list at the end of the presentation. Emergency response. Essentially, this is a new provision in the RAF. It was announced as part of the emergency policy review some time ago, but now is being also formalized in the resource allocation framework, which is the High Commissioner will put aside an annual envelope of an emergency reserve, and drawdowns from that reserve are delegated to the regional bureau directors up to 5 million per emergency, and to the AHC operation up to 10 million per emergency. These drawdowns can be used only for ops and ABOT in country operations. This is not to start creating staffing. This is not to increase the size of HQ or regional bureaus. This is really to have the first necessary investment of resources in the very early stages of emergency response. Once these provisions are exhausted, the normal decision making through the budget committee where additional oil increases will kick in, as I've described when presenting the previous slide. In relation to emergency response, there are also several conditions that are being eased. You would be probably familiar that whenever there is a change of a position, we have several notification requirements. So the notification of intent is being waived in emergency situations. We have a requirement that appointed staff should serve at least 1 year in a position, but that's also being waived. And also changes to positions which are typically to kick in after 6 months are reduced to 3 months only in case of emergency situations. some of these provisions have been already exercised through the special measures in recent years for specific operations. Now, conditions governing delegation. So there are two sets of conditions in the resource allocation framework. One relates to the financial management, basically all the reallocations of OP and OL. So one is that the reallocations are to serve whatever is approved in the operations plan to start with. You cannot just continue adding elements into the operation plan or arbitrarily dropping them. So it's really to support achievement of objectives in the approved plan. Respect for earmarking that I've already mentioned. There are certain reallocations within OL staff budget. The reallocations, for example, intended OL reductions that would push implementation rate are not allowed. Reallocation of GLDC annual provision for local training for other purposes not allowed. Hospitality cannot be increased. And two important elements, which is documentation of decisions. No matter at what level the decisions have been taken, whether it's a sub-office level, country level, or regional level, those decisions have to be documented, even if there is no explicit requirement of a change in a system. And then chain of decision making, this is basically a condition if you look in the RAF, which basically says don't push a decision up if you can take the decision to your level. This has become a practice that in some instances, people don't take a decision, they push it to the next level. We're trying to really pass the message that the decision-making exercise the full authority that is being delegated to individual managers within the conditions that are govern them and document them, and don't push basically decision-making unnecessarily to an upper level. On similar to financial management conditions, there is also on position management. Again, respect for earmarking. This is specifically there because increasingly we get earmark contribution that finance specific positions, particularly in the area of protection, SGBV, etc. The position management within regional bureaus, I've mentioned, it comes to the structural changes that needs to be referred to the senior executive team. There are certain limitations on redeployments. For example, you cannot redeploy national positions from one country to the other. It's a discontinuation and creation. There are limitations on creation of MPO positions. This specifically refers to 8 headquarters locations of the UN Common System, which are listed in the RAF. It's Geneva, New York, Paris, Madrid, etc. Standard effective date, we're formally communicating that position changes will come into force on the 1st or on the 16th of the month. So sometimes colleagues tend to ask that arbitrary date within a month, which is not possible to implement in the system. Notifications, there is a requirement to notify of an intended change, meaning before decision is taken, before something is tabled for decision making, whenever there is a colleague appointed to that position that is considered for change, he or she is notified. Same way, notification of a decision. And then some of the minimum periods that I've mentioned earlier, such as 6 months, that a change of a position will kick in after the notification of a decision, and the minimum service lengths for appointed staff members. Some of these have been in practice. Some of these restrictions have been actually formally prescribed by the RAF or any other framework that govern personnel matters, no matter whether it was professional staff or locally recruited staff. But we're trying to really put in one place one list of conditions that needs to be applied and followed and procedures, so we do not confuse the boss managers and the staff members alike. I think I've spoken quite a bit. Just a couple of final remarks before I just open for Q&A. Hopefully I didn't bore you to death and you haven't fallen asleep because of a lunch or my speaking. So the authorities will kick in from the 1st of January 2020. The timeline is primarily driven by the fact that the regional bureaus are becoming fully operational only as of 1st of January. We have some homework to do in HQ, which is the detailed annex for the processes and the templates for documenting, notifying, or requesting decisions. This is work in progress, and I'm really hoping it will be finalized by end of October. And there have been a lot of questions about annual program review. At HQ, there have been a couple of different proposals looked at how to approach annual program review next year specifically. And there is a significant redesign option on the table, which hopefully will be finalized also by end of November, early December. If things move the way they are moving now, hopefully field operations will have to think about APR much later than usual. This is as far as I can go on these topics. I'll stop here and open for Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Arman. We are all now unmuted, so floor is open for questions. Yes.
Hi, Arman.
Yep.
My name is Drita. I come from Kosovo Operation. I want to ask a specific question. We are not Office of Representative, but Chief of Mission Office, and I assume the responsibilities are same as representative office, right?
Exactly, absolutely. The term representative is equated to also Chief of Mission.
My question is this one. We have this approved envelope to 20, and Bureau discontinued all affiliate workforce positions. Is Chief of Mission now authorized to create them, or we need to seek approval from Bureau for 2020?
From January 2020, the Chief of Mission is authorized, provided you have the necessary funding to do it. So it's really a reprioritization exercise within your envelope.
Okay, so if we have available funds, we are allowed to create affiliate UNOPS, for example, positions.
As long as you can continue also meeting the other objectives that are agreed with the Bureau.
Okay, so we need to consult them just for.
I think you would need to. I mean, these kind of decisions will be still documented and notified. So it's part of notification process. If the impact is not significant, I don't think anybody will raise additional questions. If, let's say, you take 80% of your ops budget and convert it into affiliate workforce, I think issues would come up.
No, it's a question for one or two positions.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that's within the delegated authority.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Arman. Chloe from Bangladesh Operation. I just wanted to clarify a point you made on well increase linked to local fundraising from private sources. By local fundraising, do we mean fund contributions earmarked at country level or objective level or something, but earmarked directly to the operation?
No, local fundraising, we mean, is fundraising from local sources. So there are local foundations. There are local companies from which you approach and you obtain additional funding. Then you can increase OL coming from those partnerships.
Okay. Because in our operation, we have private funding coming from outside the country, but that we have developed because they are coming on mission quite often, and we developed a proposal that they accepted. That would not be considered local if...
No, that will not be considered local because the fundraising is happening elsewhere. It's part of the broader PSP fundraising strategy, which tries to get over $500 million now annually. So all operations are encouraged to do both local fundraising and also contribute and cooperate with the PSP global fundraising efforts.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Hi, Arman. My name is Angela Carvajarino. I work in the Bureau of the Americas as Senior Desk Officer. Just one question following the question of our colleague from Bangladesh. What happened with the message that was given to operations to sell first their oil instead of looking for additional contributions that will increase their oil? Because now it's not allowing representatives to increase oil when local fundraising comes.
I mean, that didn't go away. When you look at the resource allocation framework, I should have probably made it clear from the very beginning. The effort should be for fundraising the OL, and it typically involves producing project proposals locally and internationally to get funding as much as possible to finance the OL. The idea behind local fundraising increase which enables OL increases is really situations where HQ does not factor to get this funding. So from January 2020, HQ will not be factoring in the OL projections, say the trust funds, UN-administered trust funds. Those sources will not. If there are new partnerships that are just being created, they are not part of the existing PSP private sector partnership framework of the organization. Again, I mean, those funding, it's a new net additional money coming in. So instead of forcing operations to absorb it into existing OL, organization is putting some incentives to enable greater flexibility on the operations. But the overall need to continue working to finance the OL is still there. That doesn't go away.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is Reza from Algeria operation. I have a question with regard to the task force. We used in the past, getting clearance from the MENA Bureau, the MENA director, to recruit UNOP staff, as they are mainly doing the registration at RSD. But in the same time, now it's well understood that this decision can be made at the country level without consulting or getting clearance from the MENA director. But what about because we use also to contact also the HRM for clearance. Is still there? Even if you have the authority, we still need to consult the HRM in this process?
In certain areas, I think no, clearance processes haven't changed, because clearance really refers to the actual recruitment of a particular individual for a particular function. What happens on the resource allocation framework, you are allowed to allocate resources for a particular function. But then whom you recruit, depending on the nature of the function, may or may not require clearances. So the clearance part of individual selection hasn't changed. I mean, I know the HR is looking into different models around different modalities about clearances. The bureaus will have a new function which is called HR business partner function in the bureau, who will be the entry point for field operations, for basically finding the right people for the functions that you are seeking for. So there are changes coming in that direction, but strictly the revision of the RAF does not alter those processes when it comes to the functional clearance.
Okay, on that side. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Arman from Azerbaijan operation, and I have a question which is specific to Azerbaijan country context, because the recent trend among UN agencies is now that they are approaching directly EU delegation, country delegation, and they participate in the call for proposal as a normal NGO or like other organizations, and they get grants for projects which are being further implemented directly or indirectly. So under the new RAF, would it be feasible that the RAF approaches directly the EU, country EU delegation? Thank you.
EU and the World Bank are actually specifically excluded, because EU decision-making actually still continues to happen in Brussels. When we look at the EU structure, EU as a funding mechanism, all the decisions on earmarking and what envelopes are being allocated are actually taking place in Brussels. Their local EU representations have some say in terms of informing that, but it's largely a Brussels process. That's why the fundraising related to EU and World Bank has not been decentralized. It's actually explicitly mentioned in the RAF.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'm Walid from Jordan Operation. Two parts in my question about the selection for the partner and the waiver to select a new partner. On what level? And the threshold for the LCC, RCC, and FCC. Is it any change with the decentralization process?
Thank you for the questions. On the IP selection, this has not been changed. It hasn't been governed by the resource allocation framework. It's actually under the implementing partnership framework. I know there are some attempts to review these areas, but I can't speak to any immediate change. Talking about the changes in the thresholds of the contract committees, there have been actually changes in the thresholds of contract committees. Particularly, there is a formalization of 100,000 of a sub-office level. The country level stays at 250,000, if I remember correctly. And the current regional committees, which are in different regional offices, are actually being folded into single regional committee in each regional bureau with a $2.5 million ceiling on procurement. So these are the changes. I mean, there are further, I believe, another change in the same area actually relates to the asset management boards, which is a reconfiguration of creation of regional asset management boards in every regional bureau. The related administrative instructions have been issued together with the RAF resource allocation framework instructions. So it's in the same message from the High Commissioner end of August.
Any last questions? No? Then thank you so much, Arman.
Thank you.